It was a sultry Tuesday in the suburbs of Austin, Texas. The air seemed motionless, filled with the scent of blooming acacias and dust. The white curtains on the windows of Dira's house swayed slightly under the pressure of a weak breeze, but their movement was barely noticeable, as if time itself had frozen in anticipation. The house, which should have been filled with peace and comfort, more resembled a taut string, ready to snap at any moment. Dira stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with methodical precision. The sound of the knife hitting the wooden cutting board evenly resembled the ticking of a delayed action bomb. On the stove, the soup was coming to a boil with lazy bubbling, filling the kitchen with heavy, moist steam. She worked concentratedly, but her hands moved mechanically, almost automatically, as if her body lived a separate life. From the adjacent dining room came the sounds of her husband, Marshall's footsteps. He was moving from the table to the buffet, rearranging something and rustling cloth napkins. This was his usual behavior before visits from his mother, Allison. His bustling, with which he set the table, was both irritating and predictable. Finally he spoke, trying to make his voice sound neutral, but a hint of caution slipped through. "Allison will be here in 10 minutes, he announced from around the corner. "Maybe today everything will go smoothly?" Dira froze for a moment, holding the knife over a bright green bell pepper. She did not turn around, did not interrupt her work. Only the corners of her lips slightly lifted in a restrained, almost imperceptible smile. "You said the same thing last time," she noted in an even tone, without much emotion. "And if my memory serves me right, then I found out that the salad was too sour and I was too lazy a hostess." Marshall's footsteps came closer. He appeared in the doorway, uncertainly fidgeting with the sleeve of his shirt. His dark chestnut hair, usually perfectly styled, now looked slightly disheveled. He tried to smile, but his smile was as strained as his manners. "Dira, let's just try. For us," he said, pausing to choose his words. She finally looked up at him. Her brown eyes met his blue ones, but there was no warmth in her gaze, only a cold, burning calm. "For us? Or for her?" she replied calmly, but there was a barely suppressed challenge in her words. Marshall looked away. He tried to say something else but didn't have time. The doorbell rang unexpectedly loudly, filling the house with a sound that made Dira shudder. Allison entered the house as if she were a queen granting a favor to her subjects. Her pointed-toe shoes clicked loudly on the wooden floor, and her movement was accompanied by a light scent of lily and citrus. A silk scarf lay on her shoulders, which she elegantly removed, immediately throwing it onto the nearest chair. "Oh, Dira," she began in her honeyed voice, which always held a hint of venom. "How nice of you to feed us again. I hope this time you managed to make something worthy." Dira slowly placed the knife on the cutting board, turned to her mother-in-law and met her gaze. A smile appeared on her face, soft, almost genuine. But this smile was deceptive. "Welcome, Allison," she said. "I prepared your favorite salad and quiche. I hope you like it." Allison raised her perfectly groomed eyebrows and slowly removed her sunglasses. "Quiche?" she asked with a hint of mockery. "Let's see if you turned it into charcoal again." Marshall quickly poured her a glass of white wine, his movement so abrupt that a few drops fell on the tablecloth. Allison, without saying a word, took the glass, looked at her son as if doing him a favor, and took a sip. Lunch began, as always, with deliberately calm discussions. Allison delightedly talked about her latest gala evening, her charitable initiatives, and new purchases. Her voice was pleasant and confident, but her gaze always held a hidden reproach. Dira nodded in the right places, but her thoughts were far from this room. "Are you even listening to me, Dira?" Allison suddenly interrupted herself. Her voice sounded louder than expected. "I just told you about poor Hazel. You remember her, right? My best friend." "I think so," Dira replied calmly, trying not to show her inner irritation. Allison leaned forward, her eyes narrowing like a snake about to strike. "She urgently needs a new home, and yours one would be perfect. Cozy, spacious, a real home. Why shouldn't she stay here while she finds something of her own?" At that moment, the house became so quiet that the sound of a car passing by outside could be heard. Dira felt anger rising within her, but her face remained absolutely calm. "Allison," This is our home, she said calmly. Marshall and I worked hard to create this place. Allison leaned back in her chair, her lips curling into a sarcastic smile. Yours, she said, slowly drawing out the word. If my memory serves me right, I helped you with the down payment. Or have you already forgotten? Dira felt her heart start to beat faster. Her gaze darted to Marshall, who was silent, as if trying to dissolve into the air. This moment could have been the climax, but the tension continued to build, and everything that happened next would forever change their lives. The kitchen was filled with quiet tension, which seemed to fill every corner. Dara stood at the sink, methodically loading dirty dishes into the dishwasher. Her movements were sharp but precise. Her head was buzzing from the ringing of the words Allison had thrown at her during lunch. This wasn't the first time her mother-in-law had spoken to her this way, but today her words had penetrated deeper, like sharp needles stuck under the skin. In the dining room, Marshall and Allison continued their conversation. Allison's voice sounded muffled, but from the intonation, Dara could imagine how she was gesturing to give her words conviction. It seemed that Allison was determined to push her idea to the end. Come on, Marshall, it's only temporary, she said, her voice low but confident. Hazel is family. Don't you want to help her in a difficult moment? There was no response. Dara felt her irritation growing. She closed the dishwasher door and abruptly wiped her hands on a towel. She could no longer stay in the kitchen. She had to hear what Marshall would say to his mother, or more likely, what he wouldn't say. When she entered the dining room, their conversation stopped. Allison leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if waiting for the next move in her chess game. Her lips curled into a slight smile, which Dara had long learned to perceive as a challenge. Ah, there you are, dear, Allison began, her voice like sweet poison. We were just discussing how you could help us sort everything out. Help us? Dara asked, her voice cold but steady. She glanced at Marshall, who lowered his eyes as if studying the pattern on the tablecloth. Yes, help, Allison confirmed, tossing her perfectly styled hair back. You don't want to look selfish, do you? After all, Hazel needs help, and your home is what she could call a refuge. Our home, Dara emphasized, feeling anger rising within her. Allison, I respect your feelings, but this is our space. I think you understand that such decisions should be made together. Marshall looked up at his wife. His face expressed a mixture of guilt and confusion, as if he were torn between two forces that could not find common ground. Maybe we can discuss this later, he suggested uncertainly, as if hoping to postpone the inevitable. No, Marshall, Dara said firmly, her voice growing louder. We won't postpone it. You need to tell her that this is impossible. Hazel will not live here. Period. Allison leaned forward, her eyes flashing. Now she spoke not as a guest, but as someone used to dictating her terms. You speak as if you have some right to decide anything here. Her tone was icy. Maybe you've forgotten who helped you buy this house. Maybe you've forgotten that without our support, you would still be living in your, what was it, little apartment downtown? This was our home because we made it that way, Dara countered, her voice growing firmer with each word. And your contribution, Allison, does not give you the right to control what happens here? You're ungrateful, Allison snapped, her voice ringing in the air like the sound of tearing fabric. Marshall, look at this. Is this the woman you chose? She doesn't even understand what it means to be part of a family. Enough! Dara's voice cut through the air. Her chest heaved heavily, but she could no longer remain silent. Family? You talk about family, Allison? Family is support and respect, and all you do is control and humiliate. Marshall stood up, trying to intervene, but his voice was drowned out in the surge of emotions. Allison abruptly stood up from the table. Her face was white with anger, and her eyes, usually shining with self-satisfaction, now burned. You will regret this, Dara, she hissed, and before anyone could do anything, she rushed to the kitchen. What happened next was like slow motion. Allison grabbed the pot of hot oil that was on the stove. Her movements were quick and sharp. Marshall shouted something, but it was too late. The hot oil crashed down on Dara with a deafening hiss. Her scream tore through the air, and time seemed to stop. The hot oil seemed to burn not only her skin, but also her consciousness. The pain was so intense that the world around her seemed to fade. She couldn't hear anything but the deafening ringing in her ears. The air was filled with the sharp smell of burnt oil and screams, but all of it seemed distant, almost unreal. Dara staggered backward, leaning on the edge of the table, her hands shaking and her skin pulsing with unbearable pain. She instinctively covered her face with her hands, but the touch only intensified the suffering. "Damn it, Allison!" Marshall shouted, his voice desperate. He rushed to Dara, but she pushed him away, her gaze filled with a mixture of anger and horror. "Don't touch me," she whispered, but her words were filled with steely resolve. She staggered but found the strength to step back. Her eyes darted to Allison, who stood motionless, like a statue. Allison's gaze was cold, almost devoid of emotion. "It was an accident," Allison said, as if squeezing out an excuse. Her voice was dry, without a trace of remorse. "You're too emotional, Dara. If you had just listened, nothing would have happened." Those words were like a slap in the face. Dara felt something inside her breaking. Her hands fell helplessly, and her eyes filled with tears that immediately burned her damaged skin. "Emotional?" Her voice was quiet, but there was a hidden volcano of rage in it. You just burned me, and you're blaming me?" Marshall stood between them, his hands helplessly hanging in the air. He tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His face expressed a mixture of guilt and panic. "We need to take you to the hospital," he finally managed to say, but his voice sounded weaker than it should have. "No," Dara sharply replied. Her gaze met Allison's eyes again. "I'll handle it myself." She snatched the car keys from the stand by the door and headed for the exit. Marshall tried to follow her, but she turned around, her face contorted with pain and anger. "Stay here. You have nothing more to say to me," she said before walking out the door. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel as she drove down the road. The pain was so intense that every movement felt like torture. Her skin was on fire, like a flame, and every beat of her heart pulsed in the burned areas. But much stronger than the physical pain was the pain inside. Allison's words, her cold, indifferent gaze, Marshall's silence, all of it swirled in Dara's head, like a closed loop. She felt broken, as if everything she had once considered her strength had been ripped from her hands. When she stopped in front of the hospital's reception area, her legs weakened. As soon as she stepped inside, she saw a nurse rushing towards her. "Ma'am, are you okay?" asked the woman with short blonde hair, her face expressing genuine concern. Dara tried to say something, but her voice traitorously faltered. "I have burns. I need help." The nurse immediately grabbed her by the hand, leading her to the nearest bed. "Come on, let me examine you," she said softly but confidently. "Try to relax." But relaxing was impossible. Every touch on her skin reminded her of the horrifying moment in the kitchen. The pain intensified as soon as the doctor began cleaning the damaged areas and applying ointment. "These are second-degree burns," the doctor said, his voice professional but sympathetic. "We will treat them and apply bandages, but there may be scars. You will need to come for dressings and monitor the condition of your skin." The doctor's words sounded like a sentence. Scars, her face, her hands, all of this would now change forever. She felt a tear roll down her cheek, but she quickly wiped it away, not wanting to show her weakness. Later, when Dara sat alone in the ward, the physical pain had subsided somewhat under the influence of painkillers. But this was only physical pain. A deep, exhausting emptiness remained inside. She tried to understand how this had happened, how she had allowed this family to poison her life so much that she hadn't seen where it was leading. The ward door opened, and a social worker named Annabelle entered. Her brown eyes were full of warmth, and she held a tablet in her hands. "Dara," she began, sitting down next to her, "I'm here to discuss what to do next. If you don't want to go back home, we can find you temporary housing." "Temporary housing?" Dara asked, her voice quiet, almost lifeless. Annabelle nodded. "What happened? It's not your fault," she said firmly. "And you don't need to put yourself in danger again." Those words echoed in Dara's consciousness. "Not your fault." She repeated them to herself, trying to believe in them. But this turned out to be harder than she could have imagined. When she left the hospital, her face and hands were covered in bandages. She rented a room in a motel on the outskirts of Austin. In the room with dim yellow light and the smell of cheap cleaning solution, she felt for the first time in many years. Free. But along with this realization came the understanding. Her life, her marriage, all of it was ruined. And although the pain still reminded her of itself, at that moment, she made an important decision. She would not let this define her future. She took a notebook from her bag and wrote one word in large letters: freedom. This was the beginning of her new life. The courtroom was enormous, cold and imposing. High ceilings amplified every word spoken in the room, as if the air itself emphasized the significance of what was happening. The walls were painted in a light gray, almost sterile color, and the heavy wooden benches gave the place a sternness. For Dira, this was not just a courtroom. It was a stage where she had to not only defend herself, but also stand up for her right to justice. She sat at the table with her lawyer, Nolan Price, a tall man with a stern face, slightly graying temples, and confidence that could be felt in every movement. His presence was reassuring, but Dara still felt her heart pounding. Her hands, hidden under long sleeves, trembled slightly. The burns still hurt, but the memory of the moment when her mother-in-law poured hot oil on her hurt much more. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Allison entered. She wore a perfectly fitting light beige suit, and her hair was styled with such care that it seemed she was preparing for a grand entrance. But her gaze was cold, almost icy. She walked to the defense table, her steps quick and confident, as if she considered this trial a mere formality. Marshall was not there. His absence was felt like a knife in Dira's heart. He had not come to support her. He had not taken her side. This silent betrayal even more starkly underscored her loneliness. But in this loneliness, she found resolve. When the judge entered the courtroom, everyone stood. His stern gaze swept over those present before he sat down and announced the start of the hearing. The prosecutor stood up, slowly and clearly reading the charges. Allison Winslow is charged with assault using hot oil, causing second-degree injuries to the plaintiff, Dara Winslow. The assault was intentional and accompanied by threats. We will present evidence and testimony to support this charge. Allison sat calmly, slightly raising her chin, as if she didn't care. Her lawyer, Mr. Hayden, a man with a soft voice and sharp manners, stood up to make a counterstatement. Your Honor, my client denies all charges. This was an accident, a result of a misunderstanding and emotional conflict. We will prove that Mrs. Winslow had no intention to cause harm. Dara felt her anger rising to her throat. An accident. Those words cut her like a knife. She tightly clenched her hands under the table, trying to maintain her composure. When the prosecutor called her to the stand, her heart beat faster. She stood up, her legs trembling slightly, but she held herself straight. The courtroom fell silent as she ascended to the witness stand. All eyes were on her. The judge asked her to swear to tell the truth, and her voice sounded steady despite the inner turmoil. I swear. The prosecutor approached, holding her medical records in his hands. Mrs. Winslow, can you tell the court what happened that day? She took a deep breath. Her gaze slid across the room and stopped on Allison. Her mother-in-law did not look at her. Her eyes were fixed somewhere to the side. It started at lunch, Dara began. Her voice was soft but confident. Allison suggested that her friends stay with us. I refused, explaining that it was impossible. The conversation became tense. She began to pressure me, reminding me that she helped us buy the house, hinting that I was nothing without her son. Her voice trembled, but she quickly regained control. Then she went to the kitchen. I thought she was just leaving the room to calm down. But a few seconds later, she took the pot of hot oil and threw it at me. It was not an accident. She did it intentionally. Dara fell silent, and there was silence in the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Winslow. Can you confirm that after that, Mrs. Allison Winslow did not apologize and did not offer help? Yes, Dara replied. She said it was my fault, that I provoked her. The jurors whispered among themselves, and their reaction was obvious. They sympathized with her. When the defense attorney took the floor, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. Hayden approached the stand, his movements slow, almost lazy. He looked intently at Dara before speaking. Mrs. Winslow, you claim that my client intentionally attacked you, but isn't it possible that you provoked her yourself? Couldn't your tone, your behavior, have caused a strong emotional reaction? Dara felt her hands clench into fists. She knew he would try to turn everything upside down. "No behavior justifies violence," she firmly replied. "I only said what I thought was right, but that didn't give her the right to cause me pain." Hayden tilted his head, feigning sympathy. Of course. But you are also human, and you are prone to mistakes. Isn't it true that you raised your voice to Mrs. Winslow that day?" "Yes, I raised my voice," Archie replied, "but that was a reaction to her humiliation and attacks. I never allowed myself to be aggressive or insult her." His questions continued, but Dara answered clearly and confidently. She felt strength growing within her. She was no longer the woman who had silently endured at the family table. After her testimony, the judge announced a recess. Nolan put his hand on her shoulder. "You were amazing," he said. "The jury sees that you are telling the truth. That's important." Dara nodded. There was a spark in her eyes that had not been there for many months. Her struggle was not over, but she had taken an important step forward. When she left the courtroom, she was surrounded by reporters. Questions rained down like rain, but she only raised her hand and said, "I just want justice. Today is the beginning." She knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt that she was holding her life in her hands again. Several weeks had passed since the first hearing. The trial was still ongoing, but Dara's life had begun to slowly take shape. Each day was a step into a new reality that she was building from scratch. She no longer had a home where she felt safe, but in the motel where she had stopped, there was a strange sense of peace. This place had no memories. Everything here was sterile and impersonal, and that helped her focus. The morning began with coffee from an automatic machine and a long list of tasks. Dara, sitting at a small table under a dim lamp, browsed sites for freelancers. Her laptop, bought before her marriage, was the only thing that reminded her of her old life, but now it had become her main tool for starting a new chapter. On the screen, offers flashed, logos, business cards, banners. She had always been good at graphic design, but before it was just a hobby. Now she had to make it her profession. She registered a company called Phoenix Studio, inspired by the image of the phoenix, a symbol of rebirth from the ashes. Every day she worked for hours, immersing herself in projects as if in meditation. The first order was small, a logo for a bakery. Then she was hired to create business cards for a law firm. With each completed project, she felt her confidence returning. One morning, sitting with a cup of coffee and looking out the window of her room, Dara received an unexpected call. The name on the screen was familiar, but she did not expect to hear it. "Hi, Dara, it's Ella," came a voice from the past. Ella had been her friend in college, but they hadn't communicated for many years. "Ella?" Dara asked, feeling her voice tremble slightly. "How did you find out where I am?" "I saw an article in the news," Ella replied, and her voice sounded sincere. Is this true? What happened?" "Yes," Dara simply replied. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the phone. "Listen, I just want you to know, if you need anything, I'm here. You can come to me or call any time. I'm proud of you," Ella said, her voice filled with warmth. Those words were like a ray of light in a dark tunnel. Dara thanked her friend and hung up, feeling a little less alone. She began to realize that there were still people around her who were ready to support her, even if she didn't ask for it. That evening, after finishing work on another order, Dara opened her laptop and began to write. She wanted to create something that could help other women in similar situations. She began collecting information, hotline numbers, legal protection tips, stories of other women. It was painful but necessary. She called the project Dara's Dawn as a symbol of a new beginning. She wrote the first article, describing her experience. The words came with difficulty. She remembered moments of humiliation, the pain of the burns, Marshall's betrayal, but with each paragraph, she felt herself letting go of that pain, turning it into a tool to help others. Soon, she found a support group for women who had experienced domestic violence. Their meetings were held in a small community center hall. There were women of different ages and backgrounds. They shared their stories, and each one was filled with pain, but also hope. At the first meetings, Dara remained silent, listening to others. She saw how they fought for their lives, for their right to happiness. At the third meeting, she finally raised her hand. Endured for a long time, she began, her voice quiet but confident. I thought that my husband's love could fix everything. I thought that if I tried my hardest, his mother would start to respect me. But I was wrong. She paused, feeling her throat tighten with emotion. I was afraid to leave, but now I understand that strength is not in enduring, but in saying enough and choosing yourself. After her words, there was silence in the room, and then several women began to applaud. Some approached her after the meeting to thank her for her honesty. At that moment, she realized that her story mattered. Her voice could inspire others. Her days were filled with work, meetings, and plans for the future. She no longer feared the scars on her face and hands. They had become a symbol of survival for her. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not weakness, but strength. One evening, after finishing writing another article for her website, she looked at the notebook lying on the table. On the first page, one word was still written: freedom. She ran her fingers over it and added another word: beginning. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the courtroom, softly illuminating the wooden benches. Dara sat at the table with her lawyer, Nolan Price. Today was the day she had both awaited and feared. The day the court would render its verdict. Her heart beat unevenly, but there was a firmness in her chest. She had done everything she could. She had told her truth. All that remained was to await justice. The room was filled with people, reporters, onlookers, and several women she knew from the support group. Their presence gave her strength. Among the crowd, Marshall was absent. His absence no longer hurt her as it once did. She had accepted his weakness and stopped expecting protection from him. When the judge entered the room, silence fell like a heavy blanket. His voice, as he began to read the verdict, sounded loud and distinct, resonating in Dara's soul. The court, having considered the evidence presented and heard both sides, finds Allison Winslow guilty of intentionally causing bodily harm to the plaintiff, Dara Winslow. Those words echoed in her head. The judge continued, announcing the sentence. Allison was sentenced to 2 years in prison and ordered to pay compensation for medical expenses and emotional distress. Dara did not feel joy. This was not a victory over Allison, but a recognition of her pain. Her inner world was filled not with triumph, but with quiet relief. The judge concluded the hearing, and people began to stand up. Reporters rushed to the exit, hoping to get an interview, but Dara remained seated, feeling her shoulders finally relax. As she exited the courtroom, she was stopped by an unfamiliar woman. Her face was kind, and her eyes were filled with genuine gratitude. Thank you for your story, the woman said. You inspired me to file a complaint against my husband. I thought I would never be able to do it, but you showed me it's possible. The woman's words touched Dara deeply. She shook her hand and said, You are stronger than you think, and I am sure you will manage. A few weeks after the trial, Dara signed the divorce papers with Marshall. They met in the mediator's office. Marshall looked tired. His gaze avoided hers. When he began to speak, his voice was quiet and apologetic. I know this won't change anything, but I'm sorry, Dara. I should have protected you. I was weak, and I'm ashamed of that. She looked at him calmly. Her heart no longer tightened with pain when she saw him. I forgive you, Marshall, she said softly, but our time is over. I chose myself. His eyes moistened, but he nodded. They signed the papers, and she left, leaving the past behind. Soon after, Dara received an invitation to speak at a conference organized by one of the largest foundations supporting women who had experienced domestic violence. She hesitated for a long time, wondering if she should participate, but then she thought about the women she had met in the support group and about how her story could truly make a difference. In the conference hall, filled with attentive faces, she told her story about the pain, the scars, the fear, and how she learned to rebuild her life. These scars on my body, she said, raising her hand to show the thin line on her skin. They are not just reminders of the past. They are proof that I survived. And if I could, then each of you can too. Her words were met with thunderous applause. After the speech, women approached her, thanking her and sharing their stories. It was a moment when Dara felt that her pain had found meaning. She had become not only a strong person, but also a woman who helped others. Dara stood on the balcony of her small apartment, watching the setting sun. Her hands were no longer bandaged, but the scars remained. She no longer felt ashamed of them. They had become a part of her new life. She took a deep breath. Her business was thriving, her website was attracting attention, and she was ready to begin the next phase of her life. Before her lay a world full of possibilities. Her phone rang. It was Ella. "So how are you, Miss Phoenix?" "Ella Bromeo." Dira smiled. She felt like a phoenix rising from the ashes. "I'm ready for the next step," she replied. And this was not the end of her story. It was the beginning.